Today's lesson is on fractions and estimation. First, we're going to look at estimating products. We're going to estimate the product by rounding each of the fractions. We're going to round them to 0, 1/2, or 1, whichever they're closest to. So for number 1, we have 1/9 times 4/5. When we're looking at 1/9, we'll first want to see what it looks like for 0, 1/2, and 1. So for 0, that would be if it's close to 0 ninths. And for 1/2, that would mean the fraction would be close to 9 ninths. Now if we look at 1/2, we want to figure out what half of 9 is. And half of 9 is 4 and 1/2, or we can say 4.5. Now we'll see which of these fractions 1/9 is closest to. And 1/9 is closest to 0 ninths, which was 0. Now we're going to do the same thing for 4/5. 0 would be the same thing as saying 0 fifths. 1/2 would be 5 fifths. And then half of 5 is 2 and 1/2, or 2.5. 4 is closest to 5. Therefore, 4/5 would be closest to 5/5, and that represents 1/2. Now we'll multiply 0 times 1, and we get 0. For number 2, we have 9/10 times 5/12. We're going to do the same thing. If we have tenths, then 0 would be 0 tenths. 1/2 would be the same thing as 10 tenths. And then 1/2 would be half of 10, which is 5, so we'd have 5 tenths. 9 is closest to 10, so 9/10 would be closest to 10 tenths, which is 1/2. For 5/12, 0/12 would be the same thing as 0. 12/12 would be 1/2. And now to find 1/2, we figure out half of 12, which is 6, and 6/12 would be 1/2. 5 is closest to 6, so 5/12 would be closest to 6/12, which is 1/2. So now to find my estimated product, we do 1 times 1/2, and that's 1/2. And now for number 3, I have 1/7 times 3/8. 0 would be the same thing as 0 sevenths. 1/2 would be 7 sevenths. And 1/2, we need to find half of 7, and that would be 3 and 1/2, or 3.5. So 3.5 over 7 would be 1/2. And now we see what 1/7 would be closest to, and 1 is closer to 0 than is 3.5, so 1/7 would be closest to 0 sevenths, which is 0. Now we'll look at 3/8. 0/8 would be 0, and 8/8 would be 1/2. Now to figure out what 1/2 would be, we find half of 8, which is 4, so 4/8 would equal 1/2. 3/8 is closest to 4/8, and 4/8 was 1/2. So now we're going to multiply 0 times 1/2, and that is 0. Now we're going to estimate with mixed numbers. So we're going to estimate the product or quotient. When we estimate with mixed numbers, we're going to round to the nearest whole number. So our fraction is going to tell us whether we keep the whole number in front the same, or if we go up to the next whole number. If our fraction is less than 1/2, then we keep the whole number in front. If our fraction is 1/2 or larger, then we go up to the next whole number. So for number 4, I have 2 and 7/8 times 6 and 1/3. So for 7/8, what I want to figure out is what is the same thing as 1/2. Half of 8 is 4. So if my numerator, which is 7, is larger than 4 or equal to 4, then my 2 will go up to a 3. If my number on the top, my numerator, is less than 4, then I will keep the 2. Since I have a 7 in my numerator, then my fraction 7/8 is larger than 1/2 because 1/2 would be the same thing as 4/8. So my 2 will go up to a 3. So 2 and 7/8 will be closer to 3 than it would be to 2. And now I do the same thing for 6 and 1/3. For 6 and 1/3, I need to figure out what would 1/2 be if I have thirds. Well, half of 3 is 1 and 1/2, or 1.5. My numerator, which is 1, is less than 1.5. So my fraction 1/3 is less than 1/2. So I'm going to keep the 6 the same, because 6 and 1/3 is closer to 6 than it is 7. Now I'm going to go ahead and multiply 3 times 6, and I get 18. So 18 would be my estimate for 2 and 7/8 times 6 and 1/3. For number 5, I have 24 and 1/5 divided by 3 and 1/2. For 24 and 1/5, I need to figure out what would 1/2 be if I am using fifths. Half of 5 is 2 and 1/2, or 2.5, 2 and 5/10. 1, which is the number I have in my numerator, is less than 2.5. So my fraction 1/5 is less than 1/2. So I'm going to keep 24 the same. Now I will look at 3 and 1/2. I have exactly 1/2. If I have exactly 1/2, I will round up. So my 3 will round up to a 4. And 24 divided by 4 is 6. And now for number 6, I have 11 and 5/6 divided by 2 and 2/3. For 5/6, I need to see if that fraction is less than 1/2 or greater than 1/2. Half of 6 is 3. So if I had 3/6, I would have exactly 1/2. I have 5/6, which is larger than that. So my fraction is greater than 1/2, so my 11 would round up to a 12. And now I have 2 and 2/3. For 2/3, I need to look at the denominator, which is 3, and half of 3 is 1 and 1/2, or 1.5. My numerator, 2, is larger than 1.5. So my fraction 2/3 is larger than 1/2. So my 2, my whole number, the 2 would round up to a 3, because 2/3 is larger than 1/2, so I'm going to round up. Now I have 12 divided by 3, and I would get 4.